I think a lot of people here know Mathilde Panot. We're so honored to have her, the head of the France Insoumise delegation in the National Assembly, elected from Ivry, which is a wonderful city southeast of Paris. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. I feel like, for people on the American left who are a little bit less familiar, but have some sense that France Insoumise, since 2017, since the presidential election that year when Jean-Luc Mélenchon ran and scored, 19.6% of the vote or 20% in the first round. And then in the parliamentary elections that year, France Insoumise made something of a breakthrough with 17 MPs elected. I think you were in that first crew of people to get elected. And then again in 2022, Mélenchon ran again. His score was even better, came very, very close to making it to the runoff. And after that, France Insoumise had, is it 80, 75?
75.
75 members of the parliament who are in office, have really taken a incredibly principled stand around a whole range of issues, in particular around Gaza, in a very, very difficult, I would say, political situation, faced a lot of demonization from the media, a real campaign against the left for its position in support of Palestinian freedom and equality. And a situation in France, it's hard for Americans to understand, but like demonstrations around Palestine were banned, were forbidden for something like a month, maybe two after October. Still, I think, very difficult for people to protest. France Insoumise has sent a delegation to the Rafah border crossing, I believe, in solidarity with the Palestinians, has called for an arms embargo against Israel, is running, I think, for the upcoming European elections. Is it Rima Hassan, who's a very prominent Palestinian activist in France? And just to say, it's a very tense and difficult political situation, not just with the Macron government that's in power and has done all sorts of terrible things, but also the growth of the far right, which has been very strong in its support for Israel, is my sense of things. In large part out of if anything defines the far right Europe-wide, but in particular in France, it's a hostility to Muslims, to immigrants. Also, has tried to kind of claim the mantle of combating anti-Semitism, ironically, because Marine Le Pen, who is the standard bearer for the far right, her father, who very famously, who led the far right in the 80s, it had its big breakthrough in 1984, I think was its first breakthrough. And then he ran for president in 88, and again several times after that, was very famous for downplaying the Holocaust, being very sort of a classical fascist anti-Semite. And now they're sort of trying to present themselves as, I don't know, the defender of Jews, against the Muslim hordes in a really racist way. And so in the lead up to, I think in particular, the 2027 presidential election, that's a ground that they are trying to stake out, and they're trying to attack the left, around that. That's something that we are familiar with. I think the political dynamics, and we can get into this, are a little bit different here. In some ways, and we can talk about this, like the left is so Jewish in this country. It's much harder for them to use the anti-Semitism cudgel against us in this false and dishonest way. But that's something that, I think people have really been attacked on, and who have taken a principled position for Palestine in France. So we're here to learn about their struggles and what the dynamics around Palestinian solidarity in France. I should mention, sorry, I'm Jonah Birch. I'm a contributing editor. I know, after I went through all of that. For Jacobin magazine. I'm a member of DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, also of Jewish Voice for Peace. My mother has just joined JVP. She's very active. I just came back from visiting her. She's been very active in Los Angeles with the JVP chapter. So we're really excited to have this enormous crowd here and to talk about our respective struggles. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mathilde Panot.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organization, and I have to say that it's a huge honor for me to be here. And I want first to introduce the MPs that are there with me. So there's Jean-François Coulombe. Maybe you can stand like this, MP. Danielle Obono, Ercilia Soudé, elle est là. Et Élise Leboucher, who is there. Yeah, exactly. So I will begin in English, but my English is not that fluent. So after this, I thank Alex for translation.
We have a translator.
But so me, I'm a president of a parliamentary group of 75 MPs, and which is the main opposition and alternative to the president Emmanuel Macron in France. And maybe I will begin to explain why we are actually nowadays in New York. We came because it's the CSW, so the event organized by the United Nations, because we won an historical victory in France last week, because France is the first country to enshrine abortion right in constitution. We are really proud of that, first because it was La France Insoumise that first passed the bill in French National Assembly. It was the 24th of November 2022. Yeah, it was a long battle. And I have to say that the president, Emmanuel Macron, was against putting abortion rights in constitution. So we push him with association, with feminist activists, and with parliamentarian and the whole society, because the Senate, which was the way that were blocking for enshrining abortion rights, there was some daughter of elected people that talk to their father saying, if you are not voting for abortion right in constitution, then we are not going to talk to you anymore. We are not going to come for Christmas. And that's how elected people changed their vote, and that we won this historical victory. And I hope that will help all the women that are fighting for the control of their bodies, and especially also United States women, because we are watching closely what's happening in here. So I hope that victories will bring other victories. So that's why we are here actually, to talk about this victory for women rights. And I have to say that it's immense honor to be with you, because you said it, we are often accused of anti-Semitism. Actually, I like all the voices for peace. Yep. And we are watching closely what you are doing in here. We watched from France. They watched it from Palestine also. I will talk about this. And we know that here in United States, if in United States you achieve to, for example, stop the weapon, giving the weapons to Netanyahu, it means that Netanyahu will not have the means to go on with genocide. So we know how important it is what you are doing in here. So thank you so much for that. Okay. And then I will talk in French. It's going to be easier for you. Donc, d'abord, je voulais dire à quel point on regarde et on admire les actions qui sont menées ici. Et c'est pas seulement depuis la France, parce que des soignants qui sont revenus de Gaza nous disaient que les Palestiniens regardaient très, très fortement ce qui se faisait en France, ce qui se faisait aux États-Unis. Et donc, les Palestiniens aussi regardent cette lutte.
I want to say, first of all, how important and what's going on here is, because it's not only in France that we see what actions that you've taken here in the street in protest, but also in Gaza, where people are watching and understanding. Nurses have come back and spoken about the importance of these actions as inspiration.
Et je pense que cette discussion que nous avons ce soir, elle est particulièrement importante parce qu'elle permet de combattre un des cadres que l'extrême droite veut poser autour de ce qui se passe au Proche-Orient, qui est de dire que ce qui se passe au Proche-Orient serait une guerre de religion et non pas une guerre coloniale.
What we're doing here tonight is very important in pushing back against the far-right framing of what is happening as a a war of civilization as opposed to what it really is, which is a colonial war.
En France, l'extrême droite essaye de faire croire qu'il y aurait une sorte de choc de civilisation, donc la théorie de Samuel Huntington, avec une guerre du bien contre le mal où le droit international n'existerait plus.
Right. In other words, the far right is portraying it as a war of good and evil, rather than a war where international law itself is at stake.
Et dans les médias français, depuis le 7 octobre, ils ne cessent de répéter que ce serait une guerre d'Israël contre le Hamas, alors qu'on le voit bien, il y a un génocide en cours en Palestine, avec une volonté de faire disparaître la Palestine et le peuple palestinien. Il n'y a qu'à voir la colonisation qui continue, notamment en Cisjordanie.
Since the 7th of October, there's been an effort to erase the Palestinian people from television screens and the news. This is something we also must fight against.
Et on voit bien, donc les organisations internationales s'est déjà inquiétées de la rhétorique génocidaire qui a été utilisée par le gouvernement israélien, avec des ministres qui parlaient des Palestiniens comme des animaux humains, et une ministre qui avait même été jusqu'à dire qu'il fallait supprimer Gaza, envoyer une bombe atomique, en disant qu'aucun Gazaoui aucun Palestinien n'était innocent.
We're also concerned to fight against the rhetoric of genocide that has come from Israeli politicians and officials themselves, including statements that they would like to razz Gaza to the ground with an atomic bomb since the attacks of October 7th, and we're also pushing back against that.
Le 26 janvier, la Cour internationale de justice a rendu une décision historique en parlant de risque génocidaire et en prononçant des mesures conservatoires à l'encontre d'Israël.
On the 27th of January, the Court of International Justice determined that there was the intent of genocide, or that a risk of genocide in Gaza. Is that?
Yeah,
okay.
Avec des mesures conservatoires, with conservative measures against Israel.
And the ruling laid down conservative measures that should be taken against Israel.
Depuis le 26 janvier, quel autre signal qu'une volonté génocidaire a été envoyée par Netanyahou, si ce n'est que, par exemple, Netanyahou a annoncé à de multiples reprises qu'il voulait mener une opération terrestre à Rafah, où sont bloqués 1,4 million de Palestiniens, sans eau, sans électricité, sans médicaments, sans nourriture.
Netanyahu has announced on multiple occasions that he wishes to lead a ground invasion that would encircle Rafah, depriving the population that is trapped there of 1.5 million Gazans of food, of water, and other provisions.
C'est une volonté génocidaire quand on demande à toute la population d'aller vers le sud, puis qu'on annonce que là où ils sont bloqués, on va les attaquer. De même, c'est une volonté génocidaire quand on voit les images de ce qu'on appelle le massacre de la farine, où des gens qui essayaient juste d'avoir accès à de l'aide alimentaire humanitaire, alors que la famine est organisée, ont été tués pour une centaine d'entre eux et blessés pour 700 autres.
It is a genocidal intent when you send people to points to collect humanitarian aid and then massacre them, as happened at the so-called Flower massacre, where over 100 Palestinians were wounded killed. And many others were wounded in an attempt to retrieve basic their food.
De même qu'il y a une volonté génocidaire quand les Palestiniens qui ne se font pas tuer par les bombes ou par les tirs risquent de mourir, et sont déjà morts pour certains enfants, de soif, de faim ou d'absence de soins.
It is also the intent to commit genocide when Palestinian children have died from not just lack of food, but of other basic necessities, water, electricity, and so on.
Et il y a un aspect dans les génocides dont on parle moins, c'est le génocide culturel. Et notamment, le 19 octobre a été bombardée une église dans laquelle s'étaient réfugiées 400 personnes, qui est une des plus vieilles églises du monde, qui là aussi montre une volonté de faire disparaître ce qui se passe culturellement à Gaza.
There's also a cultural genocide taking place in Gaza, as, for example, when on the 19th of October, one of the oldest churches in Palestine was destroyed with 400 people in it. And this is also an aspect of the struggle in Palestine.
De même que de faire taire les voix pour la Palestine, je pense notamment à Rafat al-Hariri, qui est un professeur, un poète, qui a été assassiné dans ce que les Israéliens appellent des frappes chirurgicales, puisqu'il vivait sur un immeuble où il y avait 3 étages, et seul le second étage où il vivait a été bombardé et attaqué, et donc tué. Et c'était une des grandes voix de la Palestine.
Also, the silencing of one of the great poets of Palestine, Rafat al-Tahrir, who was murdered in a so-called surgical strike on the second level of a 3-story building in which he lived by the IDF.
À Gaza se joue notre humanité. À l'Assemblée nationale, nous avons reçu des soignants d'une association qui s'appelle Palmed, qui ont passé 15 jours à Gaza pour aider les soignants palestiniens.
We have received in the National Assembly in France a group called Palmed of nurses who have been in Gaza helping people.
Et vous comprenez le franchissement de seuil de l'horreur qu'on a atteint quand des soignants qui ont choisi leur métier pour prendre soin des gens expliquent que des bébés qui sont morts 4 ou 5 heures après leur naissance d'hypothermie ont peut-être de la chance d'être morts avant de vivre dans l'enfer de Gaza.
We've had nurses who have dedicated their lives to caring for children tell us stories about babies dying of hypothermia 4 to 5 hours after they were born, and that it would be better not to have been born at all than in those conditions.
De même, une infirmière nous parlait d'un médecin palestinien qui pleurait parce qu'il venait de sauver la vie d'une petite fille de 8 mois. Et il pleurait parce qu'il se demandait s'il avait bien fait de sauver la vie de cette petite fille, parce que dans l'explosion, toute sa famille avait été tuée, qu'elle-même elle avait dû, pour survivre, être amputée des 2 bras. Et il se demandait s'il avait bien fait, dans l'urgence de prendre soin d'elle, de sauver cet enfant qui devrait vivre maintenant amputé à vie, sans famille, dans l'enfer de Gaza.
We've had doctors testify to us, breaking down in tears, describing the dilemma that they faced in saving the life of an 8-month-old girl whose entire family had died. Did they do well? Did they do right to save this girl who, in addition to losing her entire family, had to have 2 arms amputated and would live that way for the rest of her life?
À Gaza se joue notre humanité et la question qui est posée, c'est de savoir si nous allons laisser la Palestine disparaître.
In Gaza, what's at play, what's at stake, what's playing out is our humanity. And will we allow Gaza to be erased?
Parce que la Palestine disparaît déjà des écrans et des médias. Dans les médias français, les Israéliens ont été assassinés, ils ont été tués et les Palestiniens meurent.
As many of you have noticed, in the media, it's the Israelis who are massacred, whereas the Palestinians die.
De même, ils disparaissent des écrans quand le gouvernement de Netanyahou ne laisse pas des journalistes entrer dans la bande de Gaza et vient même, il y a 3 semaines de cela, de discuter une première fois une loi qui veut interdire les médias étrangers et notamment Al Jazeera, dont les journalistes ont payé un très fort tribut, un très lourd prix pour couvrir ce qui se passe à Gaza.
Journalists have been prevented from entering Gaza to cover the war, and those journalists that have made their way into Gaza have paid a very heavy price in terms of life.
Et si vous regardez dans les médias français, une chercheuse a calculé que sur 29 heures des JT, donc les moments les plus regardés des journaux télévisés de France 2 et de TF1, sur 29 heures, ils ont parlé pendant 5 minutes des Palestiniens.
A researcher has shown in France that of the 29 research of 29 hours of primetime television, the mainstream news, cable news, that only 5 minutes was devoted to Palestinians.
Quand l'Afrique du Sud a fait la plaidoirie pour génocide à l'encontre du gouvernement de Netanyahou, d'extrême droite, il y a eu sur la plaidoirie de l'Afrique du Sud 0 seconde consacrée à la plaidoirie de l'Afrique du Sud. Mais par contre, le lendemain, un média a intégralement diffusé la défense d'Israël, toute la journée.
The French media have played precisely 0 minutes of South Africa's complaint case before the International Criminal Court, Court of Justice. The next day, after the decision, the verdict was reached, they played the entire response of Israel.
De même, le 26 janvier, quand la première décision de la Cour internationale de justice tombe avec le risque génocidaire, il y a eu 10 secondes dans un des JT de France 2.
On the 26th of January, French media played 10 seconds acknowledging the verdict of the Court of Justice to do with Israel and genocide.
Cette volonté de faire disparaître la Palestine des écrans, mais aussi de faire taire les voix pour la paix. En France, il y a eu 2 responsables syndicaux qui ont été perquisitionnés et arrêtés à 6 heures du matin pour avoir diffusé des tracts pour la paix.
They've also attempted to suppress the voices for peace in Palestine, including arresting 2 trade union activists at 6 a.m. in the morning for having distributed tracts for peace.
En France, le président de l'Union juive pour la paix a été arrêté parce qu'il manifestait pour la paix, parce que les manifestations pour la paix ont été interdites pendant 1 mois et demi en France.
Even the president of the Jewish Union for Peace was arrested because for over a month and a half, all demonstrations in favor of peace against Israel's war in Gaza have been outlawed.
En France, la ministre des Droits des Femmes a menacé de couper les subventions aux associations féministes qui auraient été ambiguës sur les crimes sexuels commis par le Hamas sur les femmes israéliennes. Ce qui veut dire ambigu pour la ministre des Droits des Femmes française, c'est d'avoir aussi parlé des femmes palestiniennes.
The Minister of Women's Rights in France has threatened to cut off organizations, feminist organizations and other organizations that are guilty, in her view, of ambiguity over anti-Semitism in supporting Palestinian women and their struggle in Gaza.
Et évidemment, toutes les voix pour la paix qui critiquent le gouvernement d'extrême droite israélien sont immédiatement soupçonnées d'antisémitisme, ce qui est le cas pour nous, la France Insoumise, mais aussi Dominique de Villepin, ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères, mais aussi l'AFP, Amnesty International ou les rares intellectuels et artistes qui se sont exprimés pour la paix.
Indeed, anyone who has attacked the far-right government in Israel has been subjected to caricature and attack as anti-Semitic, including, of course, la France Insoumise, first and foremost, and but also figures from the traditional right. The former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dominique de Villepin, has been attacked for this, as has the leaders of Amnesty International and LFP. The Associated Press, the leading news agency in France, like the Associated Press.
Évidemment, cela vise à décrédibiliser les voix pour la paix, mais nous sommes très inquiets parce qu'à force d'instrumentaliser l'antisémitisme à des fins palestiniennes, les fins politiciennes, ils affaiblissent la cause essentielle qui est celle de redire à tout instant que personne jamais ne doit être discriminé d'aucune manière pour sa religion réelle ou supposée.
By trying to discredit legitimate voices for peace and by instrumentalizing charges of anti-Semitism, these attacks actually do a grave disservice to those of us who struggle against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism.
Et nous redisons avec force que oui, nous pouvons tout à fait combattre la politique d'extrême droite de Netanyahou, défendre la cause palestinienne, tout en combattant l'antisémitisme et toutes les formes de racisme.
We claim, we state that we can criticize the far-right Netanyahu government, demand peace in Gaza now, and declare that we are against and opposed to racism and anti-Semitism.
Et nous ne serons jamais d'accord pour que ce qui se passe à Gaza soit utilisé pour un racisme crasse. Par exemple, en France, des gens parlent d'antisémitisme couscous en essayant de viser nos concitoyens de confession musulmane.
We also are opposed to the utilization of this charge of anti-Semitism for a crass, another form of racism, the so-called couscous,
Yeah,
And,
2 points for Muslim.
against French Muslims as well. This is another danger.
Pour vous dire à quel point il nous décrédibilise et la force des attaques, nous sommes plusieurs ici à avoir appelé nos parents en leur disant que si quelqu'un les appelait en leur disant que nous étions morts, il ne fallait pas les croire.
To give you a sense of the ways in which we have been vilified and demonized in France, many of us have had to call our parents and tell them that if they get a phone call that says that we are dead, not to believe it.
De même, j'ai eu par exemple en 4 heures seulement 10 000 appels et menaces de mort qui sont venus de l'extrême droite.
In the same line, I have received over 10,000 threats in 4 hours.
Et tous nos meetings, ou pratiquement tous nos meetings, sont perturbés et menacés par l'extrême droite.
And almost all of our meetings in France, like this one, are threatened by and harassed by the far right.
Et pour vous donner une idée de leur subtilité, CNews, qui est un média d'extrême droite détenu par un milliardaire, avait par exemple organisé un plateau qui s'appelait LFI, : Le nazisme est-il passé à l'extrême gauche ? Avec un point d'interrogation quand même.
And to give you an idea of how this is supported at the very top levels of French society, CNews, a cable news station owned by one of the richest men in France, Bolloré, ran a banner that said, LFI, la France Insoumise, le nazisme a-t-il passé à la gauche? Has Nazism gone over to the left?
Non seulement nous ne nous tairons pas, mais je suis fière d'être la présidente du seul groupe parlementaire qui ait refusé d'applaudir la présidente de l'Assemblée nationale lorsqu'elle a affirmé un soutien inconditionnel au gouvernement d'extrême droite israélien.
And I am proud to be the leader of the parliamentary delegation, the only one that stood up and did not clap when the president of the National Assembly said that France gave all and unconditional support to Israel.
De même que je suis fière d'être d'un mouvement politique qui a toujours parlé la langue de la paix et celle du droit international en disant que toutes les vies se valent et qu'aucun crime de guerre ne peut justifier d'autres crimes de guerre et encore moins un génocide.
And I'm also proud to stand up with the delegation that I represent for peace and for international law, and to make it clear that one genocide or one crime does not justify another genocide.
Et les Insoumis ont pris beaucoup d'initiatives pour la paix et nous continuerons d'en faire. Jean-Luc Mélenchon était présent à La Haye pour la plaidoirie de l'Afrique du Sud.
La France Insoumise has taken many steps to support the cause of peace. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the party, was present at The Hague for the meeting of the International Court and its verdict.
De même qu'il s'est rendu au Liban pour alerter sur la menace de guerre généralisée qui pourrait se faire au Proche-Orient.
He also went to Libya in order...
Lebanon.
Lebanon, sorry.
Thank you.
He also went to Lebanon to make it clear the danger that we face of a generalized conflagration in the region if the war is not brought to an end.
De même, à l'initiative de Jean-François Coulombe, nous avons manifesté devant le siège de l'ONU à Genève et une délégation parlementaire sous notre conduite s'est rendue à Rafah pour exiger un cessez-le-feu immédiat et inconditionnel.
We also went to Geneva, to the international seat of the United Nations at the initiative of Jean-François Coulombe, and sent a delegation to Rafah itself.
Nous n'aurons pas à rougir devant l'histoire et je dois dire que si nous sommes sous les feux des critiques et des menaces aussi fortes, je veux redire ici à quel point dans le peuple français, la mobilisation pour la Palestine est forte et la majorité du peuple, l'immense majorité du grand nombre, est acquise à la cause de la paix.
Having said all of that, and while taking into account all of the threats and the fire from the far right, from the media, from the government that I've been talking about, I want to be clear that the immense majority of the French people are with us, are united against this war and in favor of peace.
Et non seulement la majorité du peuple français est en faveur de la paix, mais la majorité des peuples du monde et des pays du monde sont en faveur de la paix et ne supportent pas qu'on continue le génocide à Gaza.
And that's not just the French people, of course, but people all over the world are in agreement with us that the war must end and are also mobilizing in favor of peace in Gaza.
Et aucune des luttes que nous menons n'est vaine. Même si parfois nous nous sentons personnellement impuissants face à la situation horrible qui est en train de se dérouler sous nos yeux devant nos téléphones, aucune lutte n'est vaine et nous n'aurons pas à rougir devant l'histoire des actions que nous avons menées.
And despite the difficulties that we face, none of the struggles that we lead are in vain. And we have to go on and carry on with this struggle.
Et vraiment, je veux terminer par vous dire à quel point nous admirons les actions que vous menez, vous aussi dans un contexte très compliqué et dans un endroit où, si ça craque, vous avez une des clés. Et vas-y.
No,
Let's go, let's
sorry. And also that I want to underscore that we admire what you are doing here in an also difficult or complicated situation, but a situation in which you hold some of the keys to bringing about the end of the conflict.
Et que vous rencontrez aujourd'hui nous donne de la force aussi pour continuer le combat que nous ne cesserons pas de mener en France.
And we want to lend our support to the struggle that we are also conducting in France here.
Et je veux terminer, parce que nous aimons, nous, la poésie, et terminer par des poèmes, par les mots d'un grand poète martiniquais qui s'appelle Aimé Césaire.
Oh.
I can-
Do you want to read it in French? Do you want...
No, no.
Oh, do you want me to read it in English?
I will do it in
Yeah,
French.
good.
Ok.
Yeah.
Qui avait dit, et je crois que ça résonne toujours aussi fortement aujourd'hui, il disait, donc il parlait à ce moment-là aux intellectuels d'Europe. Ce que nous vous demandons à vous, intellectuels d'Europe, c'est de vous convaincre, c'est de convaincre vos compatriotes que la cause de l'homme est une, que la cause de la liberté est indivisible et qu'à chaque fois, quand il y a un Vietnamien qui tombe, chaque fois qu'il y a un Malgache qui est torturé, chaque fois qu'il y a un Juif qui est insulté, chaque fois qu'un Noir est lynché, on pourrait rajouter chaque fois qu'un Palestinien est assassiné, il y a un morceau de la civilisation universelle qui s'écroule et une flétrissure imprimée sur la joue de l'humanité. Voilà pourquoi nous menons ce combat-là, pour garder notre humanité. Merci beaucoup à vous.
Sorry, I'm just going to read the beautiful poem that was just recited to you by Aimé Césaire, the Martinican poet. And I'll just read the lines in English for those of you who didn't understand the moving words that were just pronounced. What we ask of you, the intellectuals of Europe, is to convince yourselves, to convince your compatriots that the cause of man is one, that the cause of freedom is indivisible, and that every time a Vietnamese falls, every time a Madagascan falls, every time a Madagascan is tortured, every time a Jew is insulted, every time a black is lynched, every time a Palestinian is murdered, a piece of universal civilization crumbles and a stain appears on the cheek of humanity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. What I was going to do was ask a few questions and, make a couple comments, and then we could throw it open also for other people to respond, if that's okay.
Yeah, with pleasure.
So first of all, just in terms of the strategy of the left and what it is that we're demanding, I mean, people might know the history. There was a time when France and Israel were very close. In 1956, France joined with Israel and the British to invade Suez, and in a aborted attempt to invade Suez against Nasser under Guy Mollet, the government of the left. And then later, France was instrumental in helping give the Israelis nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Obviously, particularly since 1967, the U.S. has been by far the central supporter of Israel, and militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically, in every way. I would say that up until quite recently, for us on the left in the U.S., it's been very difficult to have conversations with Israel, and it was definitely about Israel. It was an issue that pulled lots of people to the right. I do think that there has been a real breakthrough, in the last decade, but particularly in the last few months. And one of the things to say is that there are now dozens and dozens of people in Congress in the U.S. who are calling for a ceasefire, who have signed on to resolutions for a ceasefire. That would not have been possible 20 years ago. I don't think it would have been possible 10 years ago. I also think there has been a dramatic shift in public opinion that you see all over the place, particularly among young people. On campuses in the United States, support for Palestine is very, very strong. And also, just to say, among younger Jews in particular, already before this, a couple of years ago, there was a poll done that showed that over a quarter of American Jews considered Israel an apartheid state. I would say that number is going to go up. It really depends on how these questions are asked. And for us, it makes it possible for us to think going forward about pushing not just for for a ceasefire in the short term and for demands around the right of Palestinians in Gaza to return to their homes and end to the violence in the West Bank, but also for a change in the U.S. relationship with Israel and an end, first and foremost, to unconditional aid that the U.S. has supplied. I would say, lots of groups on the left in the United States are working on campaigns right now targeting pro-Israel lobby groups such as AIPAC, the American Israel Political Affairs Committee, and trying to make it impossible for politicians who consider themselves progressive to take money and support for this group. So this is sort of our strategy going forward, and this is what we're demanding. What would you say that it is, what is it that you on the left want to see the French government do in the medium term? What is our goal politically here in terms of changing this situation?
Ouais. Alors, ça a été très bien décrit sur ce qui s'est passé en 56. Mais après, à partir, on va dire, en tout cas de Chirac, la tradition diplomatique française a plutôt été d'être un appui à la cause palestinienne. Yep. Et en fait, ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'il y a eu une rupture dans une tradition qui s'était perdue depuis un temps. Pardon.
Oh, yeah.
Mais il y a une rupture dans la tradition diplomatique française. Ça, c'est la première chose à noter, peut-être.
So it was very well stated what you said about 1956 and 1967, and it's important to note that there has been a rupture in French support for Palestine. Traditionally, France has played a balancing role in the Middle East in support of Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Donc, nous n'avons eu de cesse depuis le premier jour d'appeler à un cessez-le-feu immédiat. Mais évidemment, ce n'est pas suffisant. D'abord, nous voulons nous appuyer sur le droit international. Parce que le droit international est la seule chose que nous ayons face à la loi du plus fort.
We have never ceased calling for a ceasefire since the first day of the conflict, but that is not enough. We have also asked for the application of international law.
Emmanuel Macron a mis 35 jours pour prononcer le mot cessez-le-feu.
Macron took 36 days before he pronounced the phrase cessez-le-feu, ceasefire.
Et le jour où il a prononcé le mot cessez-le-feu, le lendemain, le ministre des Affaires, le ministre de la Défense était à côté de son homologue israélien qui commettait les crimes sur les Palestiniens.
And the day after he pronounced that phrase, the Minister of War, Defense in France, the next day he was at the side of the Israeli Minister of War who was at that very moment committing acts of genocide.
La première semaine après le 7 octobre, non seulement la présidente de l'Assemblée a affirmé son soutien inconditionnel à Netanyahou, mais elle s'est ensuite rendue sur place pour se mettre en scène avec une armée qui commettait des crimes de guerre et maintenant un génocide.
The week after October 7th, the leader of the National Assembly herself went to Israel to offer unconditional support for the Israelis as they were engaged in acts of genocide or crimes.
La France est le pays qui siège au Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU. Et pourtant, la France n'a pas déposé une seule résolution à l'ONU pour aider justement à contribuer à une solution politique.
France, don't forget, has a seat on the Security Council, and it has used that 0 times to put forward any resolution of any kind to sanction or censure the Israelis or offer up a plausible ceasefires.
nous avons beaucoup d'échos de diplomates du ministère des Affaires étrangères qui, y compris, ont fait des tribunes publiques pour dire à quel point la France était en train de se déshonorer dans sa parole et surtout devenait absolument non crédible du fait du deux poids, deux mesures évident qui était pris par le gouvernement français.
We have had many members of the diplomatic corps in France on their own state that France is in a position of dishonoring itself by its actions of unconditional support of Israel and its own interests, larger interests in the Middle East.
Nous avons interrogé à plusieurs reprises le gouvernement français sur la livraison d'armes. Alors certes, ce n'est pas la France qui livre le plus d'armes, mais sur les 10 dernières années, il y a eu 200 millions d'euros d'aide d'armes qui ont été livrées au gouvernement israélien. Et nous ne savons toujours pas exactement quelles sont ces armes ou quels sont ces éléments qui sont livrés au gouvernement israélien.
We have pressed for the not just ending the delivery of arms to Israel, but information about those deliveries. Over the last 10 years, France has, it may not be the largest donor or furnisher of arms to Israel, but over the last 10 years, it has given 200 million euros worth of arms to Israel. Sorry? But we don't know what. Yeah.
Le gouvernement refuse de déclarer un embargo sur les armes.
The French government has refused to declare an embargo of arms against Israel.
De même que nous avons demandé à de nombreuses reprises que la France, comme 138 pays l'ont d'ores et déjà fait dans le monde, reconnaisse l'État de Palestine comme un signal pour la paix.
Despite the fact that over 100 countries around the world have signed on to this commitment not to deliver arms to Israel.
No. 138 countries.
Sorry? Sorry.
138 pays ont reconnu l'État de Palestine.
108 countries have signed on to recognize the state of Palestine.
Et la France refuse de le faire, et nous demandons non seulement la reconnaissance de l'État de Palestine, mais le fait que la France agisse diplomatiquement pour que la Palestine puisse être au sein même de l'ONU.
And not only has France refused to sign on to these this commitment, but it is also we have also demanded that Palestine be admitted into the United Nations, and they have refused to support this as well.
Donc la France a eu pendant des mois et des mois une position qui changeait presque tous les jours, parfois presque toutes les heures, entre les différents membres, entre le président et les différents membres du gouvernement qui parlaient.
France's position has changed all the time, sometimes day by day, sometimes hour by hour, depending on which person in the government is speaking.
Et il y a encore, après plus de 30 000 morts, et on sait que ce bilan est sous-estimé, il y a encore des ministres qui expliquent qu'Israël a le droit de se défendre, alors qu'en droit international, une puissance occupante n'a pas le droit à la défense. Ça n'existe pas en droit international.
And despite the fact that 30,000 Palestinians have died so far, and we know that that is an underestimate of how many people have died, there are still French ministers who go around saying that Israel has a right to defend itself, when under international law, an occupying power, as Israel is in this case, does not have such a right.
Donc, nous continuons à faire exister une autre voix de la France, une France indépendante pour la paix. Et je dois dire que tous les Palestiniens avec lesquels nous avons discuté ont été très choqués de la position française.
We want France to embody a different voice, a different diplomatic voice in the world than the one that it has so far. And the Palestinians that we have encountered, in part because of the historic role France has played, are absolutely shocked by the position of France on this issue.
And Daniel Obono wants to add something. Go, Daniel.
Yeah, maybe I can add just about what you asked about what we are pushing for is also on the European level for the partnership, the economic partnership between the European Union and Israel to be stopped. Yeah. As long as the genocide is ongoing.
So a change in the, not just between the French government and
no,
Israel,
but
a
European
level,
since
the EU. Yeah.
One of the main countries.
Yeah,
if we
for sure.
push for that at the European level, it could actually, with Spain and other countries, that could support this demand.
Yep.
Et les sanctions aussi, que
And
sont refiées. Yeah, sanctions.
So to follow up on something that you talked about, one of the things that's interesting. No, you're doing great. The translation is always hard. You know, I feel like I need you to translate for me too. You know, say
Don't talk about me.
yeah, no. Pretend he's not here. You should be heard and not no. You should be heard and seen. This is complicated territory, I know, but so one of the things historically was that in France, the traditional right, not the far right, but you would call like the Gaullist right in particular, tended to be, after Charles de Gaulle, who was the post-war leader, wartime general post-war leader of France, was more critical or hesitant about a relationship with Israel, seen as more of a kind of neutral arbiter up until through Chirac, right? I mean, up until Sarkozy, basically.
Et lui, il avait fait un embargo total sur les armes. Hein.
It called for...
And he did a total arms embargo.
Yeah, did a total arms embargo. Whereas sections of the traditional left, the parts of the Socialist Party left in particular, was a little bit friendlier, I would say, to the Israelis. And today, the France Insoumise is the leading force in a parliamentary coalition, electoral alliance called the NUPES, which is, I don't know how, that's how we pronounce it.
Yeah,
the NUPES, you know.
You can also.
The NUPES. But which includes a lot of the parties of the left. France Insoumise is the biggest. But there's been a lot of tension on the left around this issue with the Socialist Party section of maybe of the Green Party as well around Israel. And I just wonder if, how you handle that, how you see those debates around this.
Alors peut-être d'abord, il faut commencer par bien comprendre l'histoire. Donc Jean-Luc Mélenchon fait 22% au premier tour de l'élection présidentielle et perd à 420 000 voix le second tour, la qualification au second tour de l'élection présidentielle.
So first of all, it's good to remember a few things about the recent past. Mélenchon won 22% of the vote in the first round of the presidential election and was just 420,000 votes short of getting into the second round of the
runoff. Yeah.
The runoff of the presidential election.
À ce moment-là, nous faisons 2 mois après les élections législatives pour l'Assemblée nationale. Et pendant 13 jours, nous négocions, non pas ce que nous demandaient les autres, il faut imaginer, nous 22%, les 3 autres forces de gauche faisaient 5%, 2% et 1,5%.
So for the next 13 days, we led negotiations to determine what would happen with the forces of the left. We at 22%, keep in mind, compared to the other parties of the left, which won respectively 5%, 2%, and 1%.
Au départ, les partenaires de la NUPES nous demandaient de faire un accord en 10 points programmatiques. Et nous avons demandé, exigé qu'il y ait un programme de gouvernement avec 650 mesures du programme de gouvernement de la NUPES.
We negotiated with our partners an actual program of government based on 10 points. Oh, sorry, they wanted 10 points and then there were 650 that... Okay, sorry. Numbers have never been my strength in French. Okay, there were 10 points. We wanted 10 points and what ended up...
They wanted 10 points and we demand that there was a real government program with, at the end, 650 measures that were for governing together.
Yeah, what she said.
Arrive le premier tour des élections législatives et la NUPES gagne le premier tour des élections législatives.
Then the first round of the legislative elections arrived and NUPES won that first round.
Mais au second tour, les macronistes, ceux du parti présidentiel, préfèrent laisser passer des élus de l'extrême droite plutôt que des élus de la NUPES, avec, pour la première fois de toute l'histoire, 88 députés de l'extrême droite qui sont élus à l'Assemblée.
But then in the second round, the party of government, the president's party, the Macronists, preferred to support the far right candidate, to let the far right candidates triumph or to be elected rather than the candidates of the left around NUP. And for the first time, this resulted in 88 members of the far right what used to be the Front National and is now Rassemblement National,
National rally.
led by Marine Le Pen, to enter the parliament, the National Assembly in force.
In French National Assembly, there are 577 MPs. We are, with the NUPES, 151 MPs from the NUPES, and there are 88 from the far right. So we are the biggest opposition and the alternative to Emmanuel Macron. But soon, and you will go there, after the election, non, après les élections, on a sauvé tous les groupes parlementaires. Sinon, ils n'avaient pas de groupe parlementaire. Après les élections, ils ont commencé à remettre en cause le programme sur lequel tout le monde a été élu. Par exemple, la retraite à 60 ans.
After the election and the agreements were signed, we allowed every group to keep its every representative of the left to keep its parliamentary group. But then this resulted in each one calling into question the actual common program on which we had all been elected, including a common program over opposition to the reform of the retirement system in France.
And the fact that we were defending retirement age at 60 years old. So,
Which is lower than the legal limit today.
oui,
Yeah.
c'est 64. Puis arrive le meurtre de Naël, un jeune de 17 ans qui est tué par la police.
Then the murder of Naël, a 17-year-old, by the police, happened.
Et en France, en 1 an et demi, il y a eu 16 morts pour refus d'obtempérer, en 1 an et demi, alors qu'en Allemagne, il y a eu 1 mort pour refus d'obtempérer en 10 ans.
In France, in a year, there were 17 deaths caused by the police for refus d'obtempérer, which is a kind of refusal
When you're driving a
slow
car.
down. It's how would you translate? Well, you don't stop when the police tell you to. Yeah. Whereas in Germany, there was 1 death of this kind in the year.
In 10 years.
In 10 years.
In 10 years. Et à ce moment-là, il y a des révoltes urbaines dans les quartiers populaires. Et nous, on demande qu'il y ait des réponses politiques et non pas répressives à la colère qui s'exprime. C'est une première fracture dans la NUPES.
And then when there was a social explosion over this murder, we called for political measures rather than further repression. And this was one of the first fractures in the NUP.
Parce que les autres appelaient au calme.
Because the others just called for calm.
Puis arrive le 7 octobre et beaucoup dans la NUPES pensent que la guerre a commencé le 7 octobre et commettent selon nous une faute politique et morale.
Then arrived the 7th of October, and many members of the NUP believed somehow that the conflict began on that day. And this, we felt, was a serious political failing on their part.
Et là arrivent des caricatures sur nos positions, comme si nous n'avions pas condamné les crimes de guerre commis par le Hamas. Et certains même dans la NUPES nous appellent les complices du Hamas.
And then came the caricatures of our position, as if we had not also condemned the crimes of Hamas on October the 7th. And certain people within NUPES itself said that we were complicit with crimes of war.
Et en juin, nous avons les élections européennes. Et en fait, la Palestine est utilisée pour prétexter des divisions. Parce que chacun espère qu'aux élections européennes, qui est une élection sans le peuple, avec un fort taux d'abstention, ils puissent rediscuter du rapport de force et donc du programme.
And then came the European elections in June, which are elections without people, since the level of abstention is so high in these elections, and certain members of NUP saw a favorable relation of forces where they could reshuffle the deck, as it were, within our alliance by winning these seats, and they tried to use the issue of Palestine to this end.
Et donc, nous continuons à défendre le programme de la NUPES avec certains des partis qui étaient dans la NUPES avant, qui sont venus avec nous pour les élections européennes, avec des figures de l'Union populaire comme Rima Hassan, juriste palestinienne, qui viennent aussi dans l'élection européenne. Et nous, on continuera avec toutes celles et ceux qui le veulent pour construire l'Union populaire, pour battre Macron et Le Pen.
We, however, maintained our line and continued to fight for everyone who wanted to beat Macron and fight for a genuinely popular program, including Rima Hassan. Rima Hassan.
Yep.
She's a Palestinian voice. She's a jurist.
She's a very prominent young
We are really proud.
Yeah. Who's running on the France Insoumise list for this election that no one votes in. You know, very few people vote in. Yeah, sorry. Yep. Yeah, people understand that. So the French, the electoral system, there's elections to the European Parliament that the abstention level is very, very high. And I think what was your last election? There was like 6-7% of it's lower, basically, the percentage of the vote than in parliamentary or particularly presidential elections, in part because the vote for France Insoumise tends to come today from more working class areas where outside of cities like Paris, where the abstention level for European elections is just astronomical. Like, no one comes out, basically. So there's an upcoming European election in June that, the abstention level is going to be very high. There was some question about what the left electoral alliance would look like for this upcoming election. It's not going to happen, right? Like, there's very strong differences.
Actually, in all the polls, if we got a united list of NUPES, we were the first one. We will be the first one.
Yeah.
Even before far right.
Yeah.
That's why it's so irresponsible, because we ask until the last moment. We are presenting the list on the next week. So we waited the last moment, expecting that maybe they will be responsible enough to make a unique list,
sure,
and not different ones. This is the first thing. Second stuff, I think that the powerful people don't understand how powerful is the Palestinian cause for mobilization. Yeah. And we have seen what happened in the United States about uncommitment protest votes. Yeah. And I think the same could happen for European elections, because we will lose European election if the people are not coming to vote.
Yeah.
But we are making a really aggressive campaign for calling people to vote and to subscribe on the list, because there is 10 million people that are non-subscribed on the list, or that move in, move out, yeah, and that are not on the good place, so maybe they cannot vote. So we are making a campaign. The state refused to do that campaign before they were doing it. We are making that campaign saying, for example, rich people are voting and you. Racist people are voting and you. Yeah. And then we took some predominant journalists that all the people hate in France. And we put their face, their name, and saying they are voting and you.
Yeah.
Some of them portent plainte contre nous.
Complain against us. So
Injustice. So they are going in front of court because of that, and we are explaining that voting is not an insult, right? So then we did some with our face, saying, yeah, I'm voting, for example. Do the same.
Yeah.
Showing it's not an insult. But we are trying to bring more people to the votes, and it's the main. Which is at stake right now, is that people are going to vote. And I think powerful people don't understand that nobody agrees with the fact that on massacre une population entière. Yeah. Personne n'est d'accord avec ça, en fait. Et que, y compris, ça va ramener des gens au vote.
Nobody agrees that massacring people is a good idea, and taking a stand against that will bring people out to vote.
Well, this leads me to my last question, which is, so I'm just in terms of the thinking about the repression around Palestine and I tell a story, my favorite story to tell Americans about when I lived in Paris, which I did for a couple of years. The first time, so there are these people, Americans, people might know that a lot of the suburbs around big cities are very working class, and today often very immigrant, and in many cases non-white. And the ones around Paris, including Ivry, historically were controlled by the left when, they were working class bastions of the Communist Party historically. So the first time I went to Bobigny in 2015, I went past the city hall, and it was on I think it was Rue Karl Marx and Avenue Lenin. And then I found out.
We got the same in Ivry.
Yeah, exactly. In every one of these suburbs, there's right. It's Robespierre, it's Lenin, Marx. You're just looking at the signs. Mumia Abu Jamal in Saint Denis. I lived in Saint Denis. I was like, what? There is a Mumia Street, and people might know who that is. Someone who was a big figure up for the American left in the last 20 years. But I found out that the government of Bobigny at the time was controlled by the right. And I was like, this is bizarre. This is crazy, which says something about the kind of state of the French left before France Insoumise, before 2017. It was a very difficult situation. There have been some real breakthroughs in those neighborhoods electorally for France Insoumise. I wonder how much of the repression around Palestine and the demonization around it is, and you mentioned this before, targeted at some of these communities. I mean, there's a lot of racism and discrimination, and it's very difficult to talk about in France. I would say in some ways more difficult to talk about in France than it is in the United States, to talk about those issues. And so this is something, the way in which this issue has been used as to attack people, to attack the left, is also directed at a lot of these communities, is my sense.
Très forte.
Yeah.
Très forte. There is a big Islamophobia in France. And we are almost the only one to condemn what is happening. But it's like racist words, racist media are I don't know how to say that. What? Yeah. It's this woman. She won against extreme right media that made a picture of her like a slave, like a slave woman with their face, and she won injustice against her. But yeah, it's so much about poor neighborhood, about Muslim people or people look like Muslim people. So there is a really strong racism, and extreme far right people are raising this so much. Also with right now they are taking a lot of media. So the main media are more and more controlled by milliardaire people. I mean, 9 billionaires on 90% of the media. And one, Bolloré, which is far right directly, by more and more media to do a civilizational fight, as he's saying. So this is a lot. But just... we are kind of lucky in France because compared, for example, to Italy, where extreme right arrived at the power, took the power, and our political friends, they are doing less than 2%. We are lucky because there is La France Insoumise, and La France Insoumise is a big force that can still win the power, and that is an alternative because otherwise there is no alternative anymore. And it's really important. I'm really proud of one stuff in La France Insoumise is that I'm president of a parliamentary group with people that normally you don't see in politics. For example, in my department, in Val-de-Marne, is elected Rachel Keke, who is the first femme de ménage. First woman cleaner.
She led a strike at a hotel where she worked as a cleaner.
22 months. And they won, actually. And she's a black woman. And it's
she spoke here last year.
She spoke with DSA.
And de même qu'on a une ouvrière agricole, on a une aide-soignante qui est vice-présidente de l'Assemblée maintenant. Et au départ, ils nous ont regardés avec beaucoup de mépris. L'aide-soignante, il l'appelait la députée Bac-2. Et en fait, on a prouvé dans les faits que tout le monde pouvait faire de la politique, et même bien mieux que celles et ceux qui s'y croyaient prédestinés.
Yeah, we have people that we're very proud of that you don't normally see in politics: an agricultural worker, an aide-soignante, a nurse who only had the back two. Sorry,
No, they call it back minus two.
who didn't have the educational level that other deputies might be expected to have, and this is something. Yeah, we're very proud of.
Yeah, showing that everybody can do politics, and even better than the one that thinks that they can do politics. And we prove it being at National Assembly. And at first they were really méprisants.
They despised the
Despised,
contempt.
Really, and now they are afraid of us. And I'm really proud of that. And that brings also some other people to politics, because they watch people talking, people bringing the idea. And I think it's the only way we have, the only hope that we can change the history, that will be not Le Macron, but also not far right and not Le Pen. And yeah, we are working on that.
I want to thank you so much for it. This is amazing and really wonderful. Thanks for everyone for coming out, and yeah.